And talking energy, China is buying more of that from Russia this year at reduced prices, reaping the benefits of a plunge in European purchases. The growing cooperation between the two countries is expected to deepen when Chinese President Xi Jinping meets with Russia's Vladimir Putin in Uzbekistan on Thursday. Now, China has gained access to cheaper energy, while Russia is able to offset losses from the European Union and others, scaling back on purchases of Russian exports due to its sanction over its invasion of Ukraine. China's crude oil imports from Russia are up 17%, and its LNG imports are up 50%. South Korea has fined Alphabet's Google and Meta platforms, which include Facebook and Instagram, for privacy violations. A statement from the country's Personal Information Protection Commission says the country fined Google $50 million and Meta $22 million. Google is yet to comment on the fine, but Meta says it is considering fighting the decision in court. Inflation in the United Kingdom dipped to 9.9% in August from 10.1% in July. The national statistics data shows that the fall is attributed to a drop in petrol prices over the course of August. Petrol prices fell by 14 pence per litre between July and August, and the change in the country's inflation trend defied the expectations of the Bank of England, which said it expected inflation to peak at more than 13% this year. And still on inflation talks, but across the pond now, as they would say, inflation in the United States rose to 8.3% in August. The figure was lower than the 8.5% recorded in July. The country's Labor Department says this is due to a fall in lower petrol prices as well for the U.S. However, the prices of food, housing, and medical care continue to surge. The news drove Wall Street to its worst day in over 2 years. The Dow Jones Industrial Average sank nearly 4%, the S&P 500 dropped 4.3%, and the Nasdaq plunged more than 5%. And those are a few stories touching on the international business scene. We'll take that time out now, and there's much more coming your way on Business Edge. Investors are now expecting that the losses after the restructuring of Zambia's defaulted Eurobonds will be greater than initially projected. Zambia became the first African country to default in the pandemic era when it found itself unable to service its debts in 2020, and it failed to pay the interest on Eurobonds valued at $3 billion. The country is now seeking debt relief from its creditors. Zambia has been in talks with China, which has agreed to lead the talks. But where does this put things for the holders of the country's Eurobonds? Trevor Hambayi, financial analyst and senior partner at Development Finance Associates, joins me now from Lusaka. Trevor, it's good to hear you again, as I understand. Welcome to Business Edge once again.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you again.
All right, so let's start with this. What we're hearing from Morgan Stanley is that they believe realistically they're expecting a 35% principal haircut, a 30% cut to interest payments, and a 50% of accrued payments being written off when it comes to Zambia's Eurobonds. So please break this down for us.
So firstly, in terms of the structure as to what kind of restructuring we're going to get for this debt that the country has, is that this information is also just coming into the country at the moment. The government has been negotiating with both the bondholders as well as the official creditors to be able to restructure our debt, which is around $17.2 billion external on its own. And right now, after the country got its approval of the IMF bailout package, which came 2 weeks ago, of $1.3 billion over a 38 months period, which is a 3-year period, now we have to negotiate with each bondholder or debtor that we do have to be able to restructure. This is speaking towards having to get either haircuts, either debt forgiveness, or restructure it in terms of extending the period that we are paying. And that is the negotiation that we do have on the table. So the one that they have mentioned, yes, seems a bit ambitious. I'm not sure that we can achieve it, where they're talking about having to reduce to get a haircut to 35%, which is basically reduce their profits by 35%. The second one is they're also talking about a debt forgiveness, which is basically writing off the arrears that we have accrued. So we defaulted in November 2020. Up until December 2021, we had accrued $1.2 billion in arrears of what we should have been paying. And that is what they're talking about, having to write off 50% of that amount. But it is going to be very crucial. The issue around the negotiation is not just a question for Zambia. What they do for Zambia will determine how all the other countries will be treated that do come into play, that are requesting for debt relief from the IMF.
And this last point you make is a very vital one here, because there are lots of African countries watching the conversations with Zambia. But again, this is back to a conversation where the IMF is pushing for large-scale cancellation of repayments, not actually of the whole debts, but actually of repayments. However, what we're hearing is that these debts may simply just be rolled over into the 2030s, basically pushing this can down the road for Zambia and its citizens. So do you think that's what is really happening now? Is this just pushing this, quote unquote, the terminology, the evil day down the road?
So technically speaking, there are two sides to this. Prior to this, if you looked at the 1980s, 1990s, when most African countries got debt relief and the debt was canceled, is that it's slightly different right now, is that the countries at the moment are also carrying commercial debt, which is different from the concessional debt, which was from the financial institute, from the governments. This cannot be canceled. And the reason this can be canceled because it's commercial debt. And it's basically private entities' money, and they expect a return from there. It'll be very, very difficult for them to work towards having to actually cancel it. And I think that is a fundamental difference between the last, the 90s debt that the African countries carried and the one that they carry now. The second part about this is that they are very careful about what they want to give approval for Zambia, because this will set the benchmark for all the other countries, and it will be very difficult for them to meet that challenge. If you look at Zambia in terms of having to negotiate this, Zambia has got 44 different creditors of the 17.2 billion, and they would have to negotiate with each one separately for them to come an agreement that would be final as to what the debt position is going to be for the country.
So there has been a bit, maybe pushback is not the word, but at least some kind of opinion stated in terms of the holders of Zambian bonds. And they've basically said that they've been very displeased given the fact that they've been left out of the early restructuring negotiations. And now it's moving down the line, and then this is a situation where they're being brought in. Do you think they should have been brought in earlier, or it still would really not have changed how things are playing out at this time?
I think it was important that the bondholders were brought in a lot earlier, basically, which is based for all the debtors that owe the country. They should have been brought in a lot earlier, because there's a lot of been discussion and negotiations that have been based and agreed based on the agreements between the G20 and the Paris Club. These are different kind of bondhold creditors, because they are official bilateral bond lenders, whereas the bondholders are carrying commercial debt, which is pension funds from other people that have invested in the bond, and they are wanting to be able to classify them under the same umbrella. This is going to be very difficult, because then you find that we would have gone through all these negotiations and we get to the end, one party does not agree, and it complicates the whole process. So it is very important that they should have been brought on a lot earlier, but I'm hoping that they can be able to find a way in which to get them on board right now.
So I've wanted to ask this question for a while. All the signs were there. It was literally like just entering a street and seeing all the signs pointing to Zambia's default, which happened before the restructuring of its debts. But many people are curious. If Zambia had reached out to all of these creditors and said, I want to restructure now, I'm seeing the signs ahead of me, and I need to restructure before I default, do you think that these conversations would have picked up pace and they would have happened, and we would not have seen a Zambian default?
Absolutely. If we had done this prior to the time we actually defaulted, it was very possible for us to be able to restructure this debt. But unfortunately, it's sad that I have to mention this, but the unfortunate aspect about this is that we've got poor governance structures within our African continent, and this applies to Zambia. So we had a party and that was running the country, and they didn't have the best the interest of the country at heart, and this is why they continued to be able to borrow until the debt was unsustainable. But this was for their selfish interest around corruption, abuse of office, and personal gains of the people that were in office. And that is the principle that got us to a point where we had unsustainable debt. But in essence, is that we should have taken an earlier position to be able to restructure our debt. Rather than restructure, basically, it was to do what we call fiscal consolidation, reduce our expenditure to fall within line of what our revenue is, rather than borrow to spend the money on consumption.
Trevor, I have to ask a hard question. Are you sure the borrowing will stop even if we see a restructuring, some cancellation, some repayment, basic outlines being pushed down the road? And I ask this because of this. Zambia is very likely to be locked out of the international markets because of this situation, and that likely will take some time. So how long do you think Zambia will be locked out? If Zambia is not able to go to the international markets, what other options are there for the country in the meantime? And all of this, of course, we've seen what the president has done in just about a year that he's been in office. And as you mentioned, that package coming from the IMF, is it enough so that Zambia may not have to borrow in the coming years?
So the interesting aspect is two things have happened. Firstly, obviously, as a country, we've gotten to a point where we are restructuring our debt and we've got an IMF support. This gives us the credibility to be able to negotiate on the international market because of that IMF support. But the second thing that IMF support does is that it crystallizes us the option to be able to bring in the bilateral partners to bring in additional support so that we are able to get out of the debt crisis. And that is the more important aspect. The 1.3 billion on itself is insufficient to sort out the debt, but it will allow other partners to come on board. The other thing that has happened to Zambia as a country is that a month ago, Zambia was reclassified by the World Bank from being a middle-income country to a low-income country. Because of the last 6 years, our per capita income has fallen below the $1,000 per capita earning, which brings us into a low-income country. With that now, the country can then apply, qualifies for bilateral grants, as well as concessional loans. So I believe that they'll still continue to borrow, but they'll be borrowing on the strength of concessional loans from bilateral partners, as well as bilateral support in grants to be able to support economic recovery.
All right, Trevor, my final question sort of takes us back to the beginning. You've mentioned, I've said as well, there are many African countries watching to see how the conversations between Zambia and China, Zambia and the IMF, and Zambia and its other creditors play out. What do you think the lessons are for African nations? There are a number of countries, Kenya, Ethiopia right now, that are said to be in debt distress or high risk of debt distress or even default. A number of other countries are just one or two rungs down the ladder. What are the lessons here?
The major lesson that we must learn is an issue of governance, is that we should never be in this position as African countries. Firstly, if you do look at the African resources, the African continent is endued with the most high resources on the globe. We hold the future for the next generation because of the resources that we hold in the country. And yet we are so poor. That what we do say is Africa is so rich and yet so poor. And it's basically because of how we manage our resources. And this has then put us in a position where we go and borrow from the people that are taking our resources. We should have the resources that they are the ones asking us to borrow. So the lessons is that we should sort out our governance structures to ensure that we start acting in the best interest of the continent. We've been in this space before 1980, 1990. We're in debt crisis. We borrowed, the debt was forgiven, but then we have fallen right back less than 50 years later. And this is not acceptable. We need to change the governance. And that is the lesson that this African continent should have.
All right, Trevor Hambayi, we'll leave it at that. We are very invested in what's happening in Zambia. We'll continue to keep up to date with that situation. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. You have a good day.
All right, and we're moving things right along. We'll be back, and when we're back, it is Women in Business. The details of my superstar guest today, right after this.